Well, it's officially December, which means excitement is in the air. You know, you're going to see your family again soon. You're making your list of what you want this year. Obviously, I'm talking about the return of the Call of Duty League. After a 6-month off season, we're finally about to jump back into matches this week. And I have a few friends who are looking to get into the scene and wanted me to give them some background on the league and everything. So I decided I would just make this video and send it to them, but also post it on YouTube for anyone else who wants to get into the Call of Duty League this year, but has absolutely no idea where to start. So let's jump in and talk about it. Before we jump in, I just want to clarify, this isn't a Call of Duty channel necessarily. This is my side channel. My main channel, Right Film, is film photography related, and this side channel is just kind of my rants or niche kind of interest that I want to talk about, but I don't want to really clutter up the algorithm for my main channel. So don't expect Call of Duty content here all the time, but I will probably talk about it again at some point. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's just jump into talking about the 2024 season. This is an outline of what we're going to be looking at today. I'm mostly going for a 10,000 foot approach, just kind of covering an overview for someone who's new to the scene, not necessarily covering Twitter beef or anything like that. So we're going to be looking at the actual CDL itself and what that is, the format for this season and any changes they made for this year, the match and tournament structure, where to watch the league, the teams, some key storylines to watch coming into this year, a rough tier list of where I think the teams are going to rank, and then we'll wrap everything up and get out of here. So the Call of Duty League is the official Activision Blizzard, Microsoft now I guess, run esports league for Call of Duty. They launched this with Modern Warfare 2019, so the 2019-2020 season-ish. There are 12 regionally based franchise teams, and these teams are anywhere from organizations like Optic or FaZe that are kind of known for Call of Duty, but do have teams in other esports, to being backed by Cronky Sports and Entertainment or something like that. So it's kind of it spans the gamut of known esports organizations to sports teams to organizations who only run teams in the Call of Duty League. Let's take a look at the overall season format and structure before we jump into the individual match level of how things work. Throughout the season, teams will compete in a series of LAN tournaments called Majors, and these will take place at a few different locations across North America. We have one in Boston, Miami, Toronto, and Charlotte this year. Before each major, there will be a set of online qualifier matches to determine the seeding for the bracket for each major. Teams will earn points from match wins both at majors and from online qualifiers. Also at LAN tournaments, teams will earn bonus points based on placement at each tournament. We'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. After the last major cycle has concluded, the top 8 teams from the regular season point standings will advance to a postseason Call of Duty Championship tournament. The bracket for COD Champs is usually based on regular season point standings, so usually first place will play 8th place, second will play 7th, etc., etc. Going into the 2024 season, the league has actually made some fairly consequential changes to online versus LAN points and the number of qualifier matches played, so let's talk about that real quick. So in previous years, teams would play 5 online qualifier matches before each major. This year, they're increasing that to 7 matches per team. This does kind of make some of the match timings and the number of matches played per weekend a little funky, but I do overall like this change because it does give you more accurate seeding going into each major, even if it is more online COD. The LAN points change is also pretty significant, so they've just basically increased the bonus points that you can earn for placement at LAN tournaments. So last year, I believe the max you could get for a win at a tournament was 65 points, and they've now increased that up to 100. I've seen some discourse on Reddit and Twitter and stuff like that this change didn't really actually change much about the online to LAN balance. But I think the math that some people are doing for that is a little bit funky. So if you look at the total amount of points available for each team, online versus LAN, from last year to this year, the percentage of LAN to online basically went from 56.5% of total points coming from LAN to 59%. So it basically went from 55-45 to 60-40. And I It's only 5% change, but that does still feel pretty consequential, especially with us losing a major cycle and still increasing the land points available. I think it's still pretty consequential. That's just my take, but that's my rant for that. Let's move on. The takeaway for what this means for the season is that there will be more online Call of Duty played, but we will get some more accurate seeding for major tournaments now. But we will still have less LAN matches than we did last year, so that does kind of suck. Again, there will be more points earned from LAN now than there was last year, even with less LAN COD played, so it's still kind of a mixed bag, but we'll see how it shakes out at the end of the season. Let's talk about how matches work. So regular matches for both online qualifiers and most of the matches played on LAN are best of fives. They will go hardpoint, search and destroy, control, hardpoint, search and destroy. Hardpoint is like King of the Hill, first to 250, or the team with the most number of points when the game timer runs out. Search and destroy is 1 life per round, first to 6 rounds. You're trying to either detonate or defuse a bomb, or eliminate the opposing team. Control is the kind of in-between balance to these. You are trying to capture or defend 2 zones on the map with a time limit, or eliminate all the respawns for the opposing team. It is best of 5, first to 3 basically, and teams get 30 lives per round. The only difference to note is that grand finals for tournaments are best of 7, so they add an extra control and search and destroy, or at least they did last year. So this is where I was going to talk about where you could watch the matches, but as of the editing of this video on December 3rd, there are no announcements on where the matches will be streamed. What we know is that last year the matches were streamed on both YouTube and Twitch, but previous to that, all of the Call of Duty League matches were streamed exclusively on YouTube. They had a media rights deal with them that expired last year, so we went to both Twitch and YouTube, but we have no update currently on where matches will be streamed this year. Knowing my luck, they will announce something today when the video goes up on December the 4th, but I guess just check Twitter for an update and see where they're going to be streaming this year. So let's talk about teams. This is where Roster Mania comes in, the most exciting part about the offseason, even if it was 6 months long this year. Outside of a couple of anomaly years, teams are usually made up of 4 players, and historically this has been 1 main assault rifle player, a flex player who will play either the assault rifle or the SMG or a flex weapon depending on what's needed, and 2 submachine gun players. This has kind of changed a bit in the past few years, with roles becoming a bit more fluid and with the balance of the games kind of shifting between heavily AR focused or heavily SMG focused. Right now, I believe in MW3, it seems like it's mostly 3 ARs, 1 SMG, or 4 ARs on some maps. So this is kind of a bit moot, but that's how it worked previously. So this year was a little bit weird. Every team made a change. I don't think that's happened in the CDL era, but around 65% of the league were free agents this year. I think that's just how the contracts worked out, but we had a lot of free agents, so every team ended up making a change. The teams did end up coming a little bit top heavy, but we'll talk about that when we get to like tiers and stuff like that later. Let's just go team by team real quick. Also, to clarify, we're going to be talking about teams in order of their roster announcements. So let's jump into that now. We actually had a couple of team rebrands this year, which is kind of interesting. First, the London Royal Ravens moved to Carolina and made themselves blue. I don't know what that's about. Their justification is that Charlotte is known as the Queen City, but I've got to say, I grew up in South Carolina and I had never heard that until I saw this rebrand, and that's what they said, and I looked it up and it was true. So I don't know how I feel about this one, but the team they're fielding this year looks good, so we'll talk about that in a minute. The second one is super exciting. We have Team Heretics back in the league for the first time since Black Ops 4, I believe. They are partnering with Misfit Gaming and rebranding the Florida Mutineers to the Miami Heretics. This one's really exciting. There's a huge Spanish-speaking COD community that has just not had a team for a while, so it's really exciting to see Heretics back in the league this year. Starting out with the Boston Breach, they dropped Beans, Kremp, Vivid, Nero, and Awakening and only re-signed Snoopy. They then filled that roster out with Slasher, Priesta, and Capsidol. This team should be really interesting to watch. They may start out a little bit slow with Slasher and Priesta, the veterans, kind of guiding the two rookies towards what they want to do playstyle wise. But I think especially by the end of the year, this team should be a contender for potential championships down the road. Next up, we have the Toronto Ultra. There was some weird Twitter drama for a bit about potential huge roster changes coming to the Ultra, but they only ended up making one, which was dropping Hixie in favor of Envoy from LAT. And this is probably my favorite roster, honestly, coming into this year. They basically made the only upgrade they could and dropped Hixie for Envoy, who have very similar playstyles. Envoy is just a proven world champion. So I think this is a really exciting team to watch, and they're definitely in the top 4. Next up, we had the Atlanta FaZe making one roster move, dropping Slasher in favor of Drazah. The trio of Sib, Abizi, and Cellium have been together for a while, and they've been on top basically the whole time. So it's just been kind of them trying to find their fourth for the last few years, and this one seems like it's going to be a really good fit for them. Drazah kind of fits exactly in that flex role that they've been looking for, and his playstyle of being a very fast and very selfless player doing kind of whatever he needs to win should slot really well into this trio. So this is probably going to be another year of FaZe dominance. They're probably going to be a solid top 1 or top 2 team, honestly, all year. Next up, we have Optic Texas. The team they landed on is insanely good. This is probably the best roster that Optic has had in a long time, and there's a ton of potential for this team to be extremely dominant all year. The weird part about this team is just kind of how they got there. So they dropped Ghosty and Hook, who were kind of assumed to not be permanent solutions to what they wanted to build on their roster. Scump retired in the middle of last season, and Illy was assumedly dropped. They still never confirmed that, but Ghosty and Hook were kind of assumed to be the temporary solutions to that so they could build the roster they wanted to this year, which it seems like they have. Again, this team is stacked. They should be really good. It's just a matter of it all clicking together, and whenever that happens, they should be solidly top 4, if not top 2. Now we get to probably the most controversial roster move of the offseason. So after winning 3 tournaments, including champs last year, New York have dropped Priesta and picked up Sib. At first, everyone kind of thought this was just like a contract negotiation thing, and it still could be, but we just don't know. New York hasn't really said anything besides Priesta's side of the story of being dropped and not really being sure of what happened. Again, they just won 3 championships and are the defending world champions, so as long as Sib slots well into their team system, they should be incredibly good, like top 4 all year. I just feel weird about this change because no team has ever dropped a player right after winning the world championship. It's never happened before. It's just kind of weird, but they should be good. And now we get to the Florida Mutineers rebranding to Miami Heretics. So they did kind of squad wipe. They dropped Brack, Havoc, Capsule, and Fellow, and they did re-sign Vickle. Currently, they have a 5-man team signed, and they have not confirmed what their starting roster will be yet. But with their first match coming up this weekend, we should find out something soon. When they announced their full 5-man team of Vickle, Metals, Lucky, Eric Boom, and Journey with their coach Method Sick. Because we don't have a starting roster, and because a lot of these players haven't been in the league for a while, if they have ever been, it's kind of unknown where this team will sit in the power rankings, and I don't really know how to rank them. But the last time we had Heretics in the league in Black Ops 4 with a full Spanish team, they were really competing by the end of the year. They were like a solid top 8, top 4 competing kind of roster. So we'll see how this shakes out. I don't expect it to be flawless from the start, but they should be really good by the end of the year. Next, let's talk about the Minnesota Rokkr. So they squad wiped their team from last year. They dropped Attach, Bance, Cammy, Afro, and Fame, and they signed Accuracy, Lens, Awakening, and Vivid. This is similar to the Seattle Surge team build from last year, with like Accuracy as this like leader figure, signing a bunch of younger, newer talent. Aside from like Awakening, he's kind of been in the league for a bit. I have some faith that they'll be pretty competitive in the like mid pack, but I'm not sure if I see them breaking into the like top 4 or really competing for championships yet. They definitely could down the line, but I'm just not really sure how to rank this team yet. The LA Thieves are a very interesting team to look at. So coming out of MW2 Champs, there was a lot of questions about what this roster was going to be, because the roster of Kenny, Envoy, Drazah, and Octane did win the World Championship and Vanguard together, and they did break the Champs curse by winning an event last year in MW2, but they did also get last at Champs. So there's some big questions about what they were going to do with this roster. Everything was kind of broken open when Octane retired from competition, and from there it was just kind of a free-for-all, every man for themselves. So Kenny went to Optic, Envoy went to Toronto Ultra, and Drazah went to FaZe, leaving them with basically a full squad wipe. And they ended up making a very interesting team of mostly young talent with some kind of more longer standing talent in Cammy. So they signed Joe Deceives from LAG, Afro and Cammy from the Minnesota Rocker team last year, and Ghosty, who was Optic's kind of mid-season pickup last year. This roster should be really interesting to watch though. They kind of look a little odd on the front because there are no like long-term veterans on this team. I guess the closest is kind of Cammy. But with a kind of mixed roster of young but really promising talent and a historically strong coaching staff, I think they could really end up sitting in the like 5th, 6th range throughout the year. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see how this plays out in the long run. Now we get to talk about the Seattle Surge. So they also kind of did a squad wipe. All of their previous rosters' contracts were up, so they were all free agents at the end of last year. So they ended up losing Pred, Sib, Mac, and Accuracy, as well as their substitute Gwyn. And they signed Hook and Illy, both previously from Optic Texas together. Arcides from LAG, and before that from FaZe. And Abuza, who is a very promising rookie, I believe, who played in the European Challengers scene last year. And on paper, this team is a little weird. They kind of have 3 ARs, because Arcides and Illy both have been ARs in the league historically. Illy's usually been more of a flex. Arcides has kind of done both main AR and flex. But Abuza, who's the Challengers player they picked up, was running a main AR in Challengers, and seemingly is going to end up being paired on the SMG with Hook. So we'll see how this goes. Illy said in some interviews that Abuza's been really good with the sub and that he's run it before, but I don't follow Challenger super closely, so I'm not sure exactly how much sub he's run. But there have been some conversations that early scrims have been going really well for this team, and they've been pretty competitive. So this could work out really well for them, especially with the kind of 3 to 4 AR meta right now. It might actually work really well for this roster, so we'll see how it plays out. Right now, the mid pack of like basically 6th, 7th through like 10th is going to be really crowded with a lot of teams who have some strong upset potential on paper. It's just going to come down to how these teams end up working out with the meta and how they develop throughout the year. So I think this team's solidly going to be in the like probably 6th, 7th through 10th range, but I really don't know how to rank them in there. Now we have the Carolina Royal Ravens. They never keep players throughout the year. They pretty much always let the contracts on their players expire after year 1 and then re-sign a new roster the next year, even if it has some of the same pieces. But this year it is a full rebuild. So they dropped Asim, Nasty, Pollex, Yuli, Scraps, and Zero, and they have signed Clayster, GodRx, Real, and Gwyn. I honestly really like this team. Clayster is a 3-time world champion and a known solid leader. GodRx was previously in the league, but has been in Challengers for the last few years. And then we have 2 really promising young rookie players in Real and Gwyn. So they have all of the pieces for this to be a really solid roster. It's just going to be a matter of how well they click and how well Clayster and GodRx can kind of lead the young rookies to a solid playstyle. Surprisingly not announcing their roster last this year, we have the Vegas Legion. They usually squad wipe, and while they didn't pick up anyone's contracts, they did re-sign Standy this year. They are rounding out their roster with Attach, Nero, and Purge. This is another interesting mix of like some older talent, some kind of like mid-level younger talent who's been in the league for a couple of years, as well as 1 rookie in Purge. And again, this is another team that it's just gonna come down to how well they mesh together and how well Attach can kind of step into this leadership role and guide the younger and rookie talent to a solid system that works. I do have some hope that this roster could probably be the best roster that Vegas has fielded in a while. So we'll see how that shakes out in the long run. I really don't know where to rank this team among everyone else, but I am excited to see how they play together. Now we get some more controversy with the last team to announce, the Los Angeles Guerrillas. So this one was honestly kind of a question mark for most of the offseason because it's been pretty clear that their ownership group has wanted to get out of the league for a while, but has just not really made the moves on it. I think they literally have one staff member and now a roster, so I guess we'll see how that works out. But the controversy comes because there was another team that was apparently linked to LAG, and then out of nowhere, this is the team that they signed and announced. So I don't really know what happened with that, but let's talk about the roster a little bit. So they did keep Assault from their team from last year. I should say they re-signed him from last year, and they are filling out their roster with Diamondcon, Estriel, and Fame. So Fame and Diamondcon have both been in the league before. It's been a couple years since Diamondcon's been in the league, but he did play for New York a few years ago in Cold War, and Fame was just in the league last year, but we are getting to see a new rookie in Estriel for the first time. This is a team that I don't have a ton of hope for. They have some solid pieces, but I think with how stacked the top of the league is and how full the midfield is of teams that have a lot of potential and could make some upsets, I think this is probably the weakest of those kind of style of teams. Although I will say I have more hope for this team than I did for their roster last year. So I think it still could end up being a team that upsets at some points. And who knows, they could surprise me and make like top 4 at some point, but I just don't have a lot of hope that that's going to happen. So yeah, that's how we're feeling about that. Let's move on to the next thing. Next, I thought it'd be helpful to talk about some key storylines and teams to watch going into the season if you're new and you haven't been following before, or if you've been out for a little bit and just want to catch up on the last season. The first one, and I think probably the most interesting one, is New York making a roster change and dropping Priestahh for Sib. This is the first team that has ever made a roster change immediately after champs. Like, not even into the season at any point, because there's been teams that have done that before. But this is like straight off of winning COD champs, they drop Priestahh for Sib. I think it should be fine. It should be just a 1-to-1 slot Sib into the role Priestahh was playing. But you never know, it's a new game. So I think this will be probably the most interesting story to keep an eye on throughout the season, just to see how this New York team ends up playing out. The next story that I think is really interesting is over half of the league opted to go for full rebuilds going into 2024. So we had 7 teams squad wipe at the end of last year. Again, like 65% of the players in the league were free agents. So we've got a lot of fully or mostly rebuilt rosters going into this year. The midfield of this year is going to be really interesting to see how it shakes out. Definitely keep an eye on that pack of teams in the like 5th to 8th range, because there's a lot of really interesting rosters that again could work out, but it's just going to be a matter of how they mesh together and who figures it out first. Just keep an eye on that mid pack basically. The next one is the return of the Spanish speaking fan base with Team Heretics coming back into the league. This team was incredibly good at the end of Black Ops 4, and they unfortunately didn't make it into the franchising system of the league when it went there with Modern Warfare 2019. But the Spanish-speaking fan base runs strong, and bringing Heretics back in with a full Spanish-speaking roster should be bringing a lot of new eyes to the scene. And honestly, this team's probably going to be pretty good and pretty competitive, at least by the end of the year. So I think this is definitely a positive for the scene and a big thing to watch for this year. Moving on to Atlanta FaZe. They have been number 1 in season point standings every year since the CDL started. So 4 years in a row now. And I don't see that changing this year, honestly. The 1-to-1 change of dropping Slasher and bringing in Draza shouldn't affect the core trio of this team, who are like pretty much the 3 best players in the CDL since they joined. So I think they're going to maintain their dominance as number 1 in season point standings, but it is something to keep an eye on. This will be the 5th year in a row if they do it, which is already insane to think about. The next thing I think will play an interesting part in the season is the game, which sounds kind of obvious, but the last few years have played very similarly. And this is the first year in a while that we've kind of like really shaken up the movement systems and the perk systems and all that stuff. I think in some good ways and some bad ways, it will change the year. So for good ways, I think speeding up the movement and making the gameplay faster, I think is going to be a big win. The game got kind of stale at some points the last couple of years when there would be really, really slow control and search maps that would just be holding pre-aims and standing still. And I think this is going to be a much faster and more exciting game to watch. Currently, for the bad though, the spawn system in this game and the maps don't seem to be the best optimized for Hardpoint, which is kind of unfortunate because Hardpoint is historically been the most fun game mode to watch. Overall, by the end of the year, I think we should have a really good competitive title on our hands, but I do think it will take some patch updates and potentially some new maps coming in to really bring this game to the best place it could be from a competitive standpoint. This last one may be a little bit controversial. I don't think it is, but I think Optic fans may be a little bit salty at first. Hold on, let me explain. Optic have had a rough last few years. From the team that looked really promising in Vanguard having to change a few times because of Illy's thumb injury, to Scump retiring in the middle of last year and not being able to get the team they wanted, having to do a fill-in, to getting second place twice last year at events. They've just had a rough few years. And after the weird circumstances of the last few years, there have started to be some questions about what the real problem with Optic actually is. Because obviously, Optic is the biggest brand in Call of Duty esports. They have always been for as long as I can remember, but they haven't won a world championship since IW. And since the Modern Warfare season, they've really only won the one major in Vanguard, and that's been the extent. Besides the couple of second places they got last year, it's been rough for Optic, to say the least. But again, this team that they formed this year is, no doubt about it, it's a super team. This is the best roster they've fielded in a long time. And I think if anyone's going to bring championships back to the Optic brand, I think it's going to be this team. And this is probably the most competitive and the strongest they've looked in a long time. So I think it will work out for them, and this team will be competing all year. I think they're a top 2 team up there with FaZe, but there are still some lingering questions about the overall Optic culture and how it's really worked out the last few years, despite some strong rosters being built along the way. Lastly, to wrap everything up, let's talk about where I think these teams kind of sit relative to each other. Again, this is just my educated opinion from someone who's watched for a while, but I'm not like a coach or a player or anything to do with the scene, so I don't have any inside knowledge or anything. This is just my best estimation. So up here at the top 4, we have Atlanta, Toronto, New York, and Optic Texas sitting in this like super team category, basically. These are the best rosters that all of these teams have fielded in a while, aside from New York like kind of making a weird roster change after winning the World Championship. But I think like it's hard to argue that these teams are going to end up outside of the top 4. It would take some massive underperformances for all of them to end up dropping down to any of the teams below them. The category below that I'm calling contenders. It's like my 5th, 6th range of where I think these teams will shake out. And I have the LA Thieves and Boston Breach there. I think both of these teams have the potential and the pieces to compete for championships. I just think it's going to take a lot of work and the right circumstances on a like tournament weekend for them to get there. But I do think they both could, and I honestly wouldn't be surprised if either of them ended up winning a championship at some point this year. I think all of the teams in the last 2 categories are very close together, and I have a very hard time ranking them between each other. All of the teams in this like 7th to 12th range, I think it's just going to come down to who puts the pieces together and which teams really start to click once the season gets going. For my personal ranking right now in the like 7th, 8th range, I have the Carolina Royal Ravens and the Minnesota Rokkr. Both these teams have a strong leader and a lot of promising talent around them. So I think that gives them the best potential for consistency and figuring the pieces out pretty quickly to be a strong team and to start competing with those teams above them. The 4 teams that I put in the bottom category are just the teams that I have some kind of like standing questions about. So Miami Heretics, we don't really even know their starting roster yet. And with that, we've only ever seen one of their players in the league before, so I just don't even know what to expect with them. I do think there's a lot of potential with this team because they are some of the strongest players from European Challengers the last few years, so I think there's definitely a lot of potential here. I just don't really know what to think about them. We don't even have the roster yet. The Seattle Surge team is probably the one that I feel the most comfortable calling weird. There's a lot of potential here. I mean, you have multiple world champions on this team, and you have a really solid coach in Rambo Ray. So honestly, they could end up putting it together and placing in the like 6th, 7th, 8th range throughout the year. But they also are putting a rookie AR player on an SMG, and they do have 3 AR players basically. So if the game starts to lean towards SMGs, I could really see them struggling. But they do have a really strong coach, and they do have players who know how to win and have won before. So they could end up being great. I really don't know how to rank this team. It's a really odd composition, and I think it's the one that I'm least sure how they're going to end up playing out in the long run. Next up, we have the Vegas Legion, and I do think this team has a lot of potential, but Attach hasn't really had to be a sole leader before on a roster, and I think I have some questions about that, and I think that's just what's holding me from putting them higher. They have a lot of potential. I don't know anything about Purge or how he plays, but the Standy Nero sub-duo I do really like a lot, especially considering the other options that have been left on the table. I think that's probably the best sub-duo they could have put together. So again, this is probably the best Legion team we've seen in a while, but I also think this is the best like Carolina team we've seen in a while. We have Heretics back. We have a really good Boston and LAT team. So I just don't really know how far up they're going to be able to make it in the standings. And I could see this team being one of the teams that doesn't make champs, sadly. Lastly, we have LAG, and I want to clarify that I don't think this team is going to be awful, but the league is really stacked this year, and I think there's a lot of teams with a lot of potential this year, and I think this is honestly just the one that I have the least hope for. There's some good pieces here, like Assault is a world champion. He's won before. DiamondCon's been in the league before. He's a really solid player. I just don't really know that they're going to have the talent or the firepower or the leadership to really push into the like top 8 range. And I'm probably the most confident out of the other 11 that this team will not make champs. So that's it. That's everything I think is most important for you to know going into the 2024 CDL season. If you have anything you're curious about that I didn't cover, you can leave a comment down below or send me a DM on Twitter or something like that about it, and I'll try and respond to those and answer any questions you might have. Again, I do also want to remind you, I'm not going to be doing like consistent CDL content. This is just something that I'm really interested in and I wanted to cover for my friends, as well as anyone else out there who might be interested in getting into the CDL. So with that, thank you for watching and have an excellent rest of your day.